Welcome to the Canada in Geneva podcast, recorded from the Permanent Mission of Canada to the multilateral organizations in Geneva, Switzerland. This bilingual podcast features conversations in multilateral diplomacy with Canadian and other experts from the multilateral community. Thank you for joining us, and we hope that you enjoy this episode. Bienvenue au Balado du Canada à Genève. Ce balado bilingue présente des conversations sur la diplomatie multilatérale avec des experts canadiens et d'autres spécialistes de la communauté multilatérale. Merci de nous écouter et nous espérons que vous apprécierez cet épisode. So welcome to our listeners. Very pleased to welcome Professor Adelle Blackett as our guest interviewee today to share some reflections. And the connecting tissue in this case is the International Labour Organization, the ILO. Welcome, Adelle. Thank you for joining us.
Thank you so much. It's a delight to be with you today. I'm joining you from Montreal, the traditional territories of the Kanakahaga Nation of the Haudenosaunee Confederacy, and it's a real delight to be able to be with you. Thank you for doing this.
Thank you. So I guess we'll start at the beginning and look back to your road in some ways to the ILO, what led you to its doors and to pass its doors and work within the ILO. And I guess particularly your focus on domestic workers' rights, also known as, aka, the care economy, and looking back at your education and the building blocks that led you to that thematic and working with the ILO.
Well, thank you for that question and for the interest. In many ways, I see the relationship between what I've wound up having the great privilege to focus on in my life as very much linked to my family history and to a broader community history. I'm the descendant of enslaved Africans in the Americas. My parents came to Canada from Barbados. My mother came to Canada as a domestic worker. And they were fortunate in the moment in which they came that they came with permanent residency. They came into an economy that was flourishing. They were able to find good unionized jobs and build a family. And really establish themselves.
And can I ask, did they first come to Montreal?
They did indeed.
Do you call Montreal home? Good. Okay.
I do indeed. Yes, they came to Montreal. And, my father used to say that, so my mom came to Montreal and then my father joined her. And he says when he first saw the snow, it was January, he just thought it was the most beautiful thing ever.
Amazing.
And they made that home. So really quite lovely, but mostly they were able to convey that we had a place in this society and that we should dream and work steadfastly. They were alive to many forms of discrimination, to many challenges, but they also could dream. And so that was deeply meaningful. I also had at that time some just phenomenal mentors. I've actually just written a piece that's being published in a collection called Nuances of Blackness. And I spoke about the mentors I had in high school and college, the CEGEP system here in Quebec. Some of them had PhDs. They were teaching at that level. So that says a lot. But they were determined to offer to students the opportunities that they themselves were not able to avail themselves of. So I dreamed early that I could be a lawyer, and I was deeply interested in labor law. It seemed a way to reconcile much of my family and broader community history. And so frankly, so much of what I've done since then is to try to bring a broad, capacious understanding of labor law, one that doesn't see immigration as outside of its boundaries, but understands migrant work as related to that.
Close interconnections.
Close interconnection. And similarly, from a multilateral perspective, that sees trade as deeply linked to labor. So the movement of goods and the movement of persons as part of how we understand a rules-based liberal economic order. At the time that I was doing my graduate work, I had already had the opportunity to do an internship at the ILO. That theme comes back. I actually did an internship with Shauna Olney, who was an earlier podcast member. Circles within circles.
Circles within circles. I promise we didn't do this on purpose. This is
Indeed
an iterative process. The importance of coaching, of internships, of opening those doors. It's so important to remember that.
It's absolutely important. And the kind of impact people can have on a young person's trajectories just should never be underestimated. And so one of the senior lawyers at the ILO at the time, who I had the immense privilege to work with, saw my profile and saw that I had been volunteering at a domestic workers association in Montreal. And she said, Adelle, South Africa, which has just, emerged from a system apartheid and needs to think really concretely about what it looks like to be in a post-apartheid context. And so many South African women, Black South African women, work as domestic workers.
In the care economy. Absolutely.
There you go. So what can be done? They're not going to leave domestic work immediately, but can this work be regulated as decent work? And that was the challenge. And so here I was, a law student at the ILO, doing just fascinating comparative law research and interdisciplinary research on this theme. And the ILO published my paper, sent it to South Africa. It became the basis for much of the work on domestic work. And so when I got a call from the ILO many years later, when I was a law professor, they said, so we're thinking of regulating this area. Not many people. You came up as someone who's worked on this. Would you like to be our lead expert on Convention 189, as it would later become? And so it drew me into to drafting the Law and Practice report. So there was that dimension. And then, at the Columbia context where I did my graduate work, a parallel area. So pursuing the other multilateral theme, the trade theme, I had the opportunity to work on the relationship between trade and labor standards.
It seems we're forever explaining that connection. It's so important.
Absolutely.
Coordinating. It's regulatory cooperation.
Absolutely.
It seems to me that's what international relations are becoming now, is regulatory cooperation as the globe is interconnected. And so being able to match up those different legal areas together. Can I just ask, here's a Canadian question. You're qualified in both Quebec and Ontario as a lawyer. So that's also one of the unique aspects that Canadians can bring, is that, we're bilingual, but we're also bi-juridical, familiar with different legal systems. Huge asset for the ILO, I would have thought, to have that brought together in one person who's able to speak different legal systems.
Well, thank you for mentioning that. I did my legal study at McGill, and its program is bijural.
The national program.
Exactly. And it's broadened in, I think, really helpful ways to think about law in what is referred to as a trans-systemic approach. And so really engaging with legal traditions around the world, of which the civil law and the common law are very important pieces, increased attention to indigenous legal traditions,
yes,
and a certain ability to engage broadly. So that was very important to me. It was certainly something that the ILO was constantly calling upon, and even on the regulation of domestic work, it was immeasurably helpful to be able to look at the private law notions in different traditions that were guiding, in some cases impeding, addressing domestic workers' human rights, and to be able to bring that lens. And I've had also the opportunity to work in civilian traditions in Latin America as well, and to build on that. So that's been wonderful.
Which leads to my next question. But before that, we'll just get up close and personal, because I have to confess, it's a regret. I had a possibility of going to McGill to do the national program, and I chose not to, and I think it's one of the great mistakes I made, because I think I ended up studying solely in the common law tradition. But I see that we shared a few things. I don't know why we had to wait until I got to Geneva to meet, but we both have mooting in our legal backgrounds. Crucially important, formative experience. But also we shared very briefly Professor Roderick MacDonald. He came to my law school to teach us about civil law. And I took that course because I realized I would missed out that major portion of my education. So if I know anything about civil law, it was thanks to him. So and I see that he features in your CV.
Oh, very much so. Rod MacDonald is someone who is very dear to me. And I had the good fortune of working as a research assistant for him. And he really believed in engaging closely with legal traditions and with the civilian tradition. He actually didn't have a civil law degree. And he came to the civil law and deeply embraced it. And I think helped many to see some of the distinctiveness of the traditions, and also the ways in which one could have conversations across tradition. So that's lovely. And I guess the other piece that's from Rod that's had such an impact is his emphasis on legal pluralism, and really engaging with the various sites in which law gets made. So in labor law, we just understand that the workplace is a site of law creation, and the frameworks focus on who gets to be involved in the process of creating the laws that govern them. So that's deeply important, but it has such resonance in so many parts of the world where we might establish a code and say this is the universal law, but there's so much else happening in the societies, and the ability to look at that is crucial. And in my own work on domestic workers, it was so important to look at the household as a site of norm creation, right? That we might be saying the labor law says this, but something else is going on in that space, and we need to look at it, understand that it has a history. And it's not a lovely history. We tend to say the history is, well, domestic workers replacing the woman of the household, and that's too quick. Yes, it's gendered work, deeply gendered work, but there's more there. And so understanding histories of enslavement, understanding histories of servitude, understanding how those manifested themselves not just outside of the household, but within the household, and were literally reproduced in the household and continue, was critical to then saying, if we're actually going to change these relationships, we need to look at that. And we have to make sure that our standards actually address some of the unspoken assumptions about what these workers will do, about why they won't actually be allowed to think about their own needs, about their own limits on time, about their own children elsewhere, right? And so, rethinking the regulating so that they actually have some agency and some control over their working lives. So that was fundamental, and it is very much linked.
And the society benefit also.
Absolutely.
Through, if they're regulated, they're part of the real economy.
Yes.
And therefore contributing and benefiting, creating that virtuous cycle.
Exactly.
And it's about moving beyond the simple statement of equality. That's not enough. You can't just have it in the Charter, or be it the UN Charter, the Canadian Charter. You then have to go into the household, and how traditions and customs and people's modes of behavior, that becomes relevant too, the implementation. So here we are. We haven't even left question one. So,
but it's great. Thank you for that, because it's so, we know that domestic work is the stuff of life, right? That it is, without that reproductive care, we don't have a quote unquote productive economy, right? And yet we devalue that contribution. And so part of the core of the standard setting at the ILO was to be able to affirm that domestic work is at once work like any other, but also work like no other. And that was an important part of the dignity of domestic work, to say, you know what, we recognize that this work is critical to society. And but far from treating it as inferior, we should really be celebrating this work and valuing those who do this.
Donc, si on peut passer de l'Organisation internationale du travail et retourner un petit peu au Canada. Et donc, peut-être l'équilibre, ça va être la thématique ici, entre votre carrière d'universitaire dans le domaine du droit, principalement, mais pas seulement, mais aussi le travail au sein de la Commission des droits de la personne et des droits de la jeunesse du Québec. Ils ont l'art du beau titre. C'est bien ça, droits de la personne et de la jeunesse. Donc, comment trouver cet équilibre entre activisme, rôle dans la communauté, et rôle à l'université? Parce que un CV tellement impressionnant, diversifié, à la fois dans beaucoup de pays, mais aussi très ancré au Québec. Comment faire la part des choses? Comment trouver l'équilibre?
C'est une belle question, merci. J'avoue que j'estime avoir l'énorme privilège de faire ce qui me tient à cœur. Oui, mon histoire familiale ne me permet pas d'oublier à quel point c'est remarquable, c'est important de pouvoir faire le choix de faire ce qui nous tient à cœur. Donc, équilibre, j'ai eu de meilleurs moments et de moins bons moments, mais je dirais que j'ai eu la possibilité de faire en sorte à ce que ma carrière universitaire rejoigne mes valeurs et mes préoccupations principales. C'était pas évident de quitter l'OIT ou le secrétariat permanent de l'OIT, de BIT. J'étais fonctionnaire avant de quitter pour venir à McGill. Mais je sentais...
C'est sécurisant.
C'est un travail remarquable, mais je sentais le désir à la fois de m'enraciner dans la société québécoise et canadienne, et de pouvoir prévaloir d'une certaine autonomie au niveau de ma recherche et de l'enseignement. Donc, la vie universitaire m'a permis à la fois d'enseigner dans ces matières, d'avoir un contact constant avec des étudiants qui sont remarquables, qui ont toujours cette capacité de faire en sorte à ce qu'on répond aux vraies questions et qu'on soit vraiment au courant. J'ai adoré ça. Je me suis beaucoup engagée dans la communauté locale, donc dans des organisations communautaires, des églises historiques noires à McGill, à Montréal, au niveau du cégep. Mais j'ai aussi assez rapidement compris que ce que je pouvais apporter de particulier, c'était au niveau des organisations comme la Commission des droits de la personne et des droits de la jeunesse du Québec qui abordaient des questions d'importance réelle dans la société et qui cherchaient à gérer, à comprendre les perspectives émanant de différentes communautés de la société. Donc, j'ai passé 7 ans à la Commission des droits de la personne. Et à leur honneur, ils m'avaient invité à me joindre à eux après que j'avais écrit un article qui était quand même assez critique d'une approche.
Ça, c'est de l'ouverture d'esprit.
C'est l'ouverture d'esprit et je leur invitais à vraiment regarder comment des membres de la communauté noire pouvaient se retrouver dans des postes tellement stéréotypés, faire face à des discriminations tellement évidentes, mais qu'on les abordait pas. Dans l'analyse, on n'arrivait pas à l'aborder, que c'était important de l'aborder. Il y avait une grande écoute à ce niveau et c'est quelque chose que j'avais beaucoup apprécié. Et c'était un moment important pour une institution qui me semble névralgique dans la société, y compris en ce moment. Et par la suite, j'ai participé aussi à dans d'autres institutions. Je cherche le mot, en fait, pour le cadrer, mais c'est de dire, il y a différentes programmes mis en place, comme le programme de contestation judiciaire sur le plan fédéral, un programme qui a été rétabli récemment, qui joue un rôle démocratique remarquable parce que ça permet aux membres de la communauté d'avoir les ressources pour avoir accès aux tribunaux et ainsi de critiquer, de s'opposer à une législation en place qui nuit à leurs droits.
Oui.
Et donc, j'ai siégé à ce panel pendant presque 3 ans. Et ce programme, à mon avis, joue un rôle remarquable et actuel. Mm-hmm.
C'est tout à fait... Parfois, on en rit, mais sérieusement, c'est important cette capacité à travers le Canada de créer, où le gouvernement agit pour créer de l'espace pour permettre d'être critiqué. Donc, il y a un grand appui à la société civile, il y a des processus de consultation. Peut-être dans le contexte actuel, c'est bon à se rappeler de cette capacité quand même d'ouvrir de multiples perspectives. Donc, c'est une expérience tout à fait pertinente et remarquable. And it brings us to looking ahead. And of course, we've been through some incredible times. And for those like you who have been watching these issues all along, you'll say there's nothing new under the sun, and you have to bear with so many other parts of society who say, oh, we're just discovering there's a crisis. But George Floyd, the Black Lives Matter movement, a whole re-energizing, I hope, of the discussions around racism and how we can combat systemic racism, the extent of systemic racism in Canada. And so you have been able to bring a whole wealth of experience to that really healthy discussion in Canada. And it's sort of joined up again with the multilateral, because at the same time, the UN system has been percolating along over these years. And last summer, the Permanent Forum for People of African Descent finally landed in a General Assembly resolution in New York after long and sometimes complex conversations, perhaps drawing some energy from the Black Lives Matter discussion and the renewed desire to talk about racism more frankly in a more learned way. And so now there is going to be a permanent forum on a new basis with 5 elected representatives and 5 appointed by the president of the Human Rights Council here in Geneva. We come back to Geneva. You have applied for this, which is terrific, seeking to continue the discussion internationally. Can you talk a little bit about that current debate and what can we learn from the discussions about the permanent forum?
Thanks for that question. This is really a remarkable moment, and the world kind of stopped, right? And I want to take that really seriously. The fact that people, wherever they might have been prior to watching that unforgettable video, they were moved, right? And the pandemic situation was not separate from that. There was a real kind of understanding of the need to stop and acknowledge how much had not changed. That centuries of enslavement leave afterlives on the people who embody that, and that this is a global phenomenon.
Everywhere.
And so certainly the multilateral response, the recognition of the need to respond urgently is crucial. And so the fact that the UN Permanent Forum on People of African Descent was able to see the light in this context is a sign of hope. I've certainly written about the importance for the UN to engage carefully and closely with the depth of anti-Black racism, and to do it in the contemporary context, to think about how, as a multilateral institution, it can move forward on providing direction, guidance for the communities most affected. And it can certainly draw on its history in doing so, but it's also making history with a forum of this nature. One of the pivotal dimensions of that is, of course, the declaration that is embedded in the resolution as one of the matters that the Permanent Forum can turn its mind to. And as a lawyer, as someone who's been involved in drafting as well, certainly the ILO Convention 189, but also more recently in the university context, a Scarborough Charter on anti-Black racism.
I saw that reference. Yes.
Yeah, and that was a really meaningful opportunity to draw together some of the aspirations and promising practices that were taking place in the university sector, and to provide guidance through a charter that would embody what it would mean to make universities an inclusive space for people of African descent. And the fact that approximately 50 universities and colleges around Canada have signed on, and that this is all, it's just remarkable, right? There is And movement is happening, hiring is happening. And similarly, the work that I'm doing now, chairing the Employment Equity Act Review Task Force, one of the things that the Canadian Minister of Labour has asked us to do is to consider African Canadians or Black Canadians as a separate group for the purposes of Employment equity, yes. And so pivotal law reform possibilities that also inform the kinds of considerations that a declaration at the international level might take in place. Much of what I've learned over the past decades is the deep connection between domestic action and international action. They support each other and build upon each other. And it's important to be rooted in particular places to be able to build international texts that resonate for an international community or in different locations.
And that will then be implemented domestically.
Exactly. And so there's much inspiration that is possible if this new forum is really seized of a vision of how we can make positive change for people of African descent.
Well, on that very upbeat, forward-looking note, just to say thank you for sharing these insights today, and perhaps part of multilateralism that is not always well understood outside of the halls in New York and Geneva, where to outsiders, sometimes people think we're just arguing about placement of commas, but the placement of those commas does matter. And these texts do have real bearing on daily lives. So thank you for your commitment. Best of luck. And we look forward to chatting again at another time in the future to hopefully measure some even greater progress.
Thank you so much. This has been a tremendous opportunity, and I've really enjoyed exchanging with you.
Thank you.